Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Joanna G. Holden and I am a Christian author of fantasy as well as being an author tuber here on YouTube. And today I am presenting you with part 3 in my fantasy world building series. This week's topic is fantasy races and creatures. This is, like I said, part 3 of a series, so if you haven't watched the first 2 steps to world building in fantasy, be sure to go back and watch those so you can catch up on all that we've done. I'm going to leave the link to the playlist below in the description box so you can go check those out real quickly and then hop back and join us. Before we get started, I feel like there is a need for a huge disclaimer here. When I am talking about race, I am not talking about ethnicity. In our modern society, we tend to use the words race and ethnicity interchangeably to mean basically the same thing, which is simply a difference of physical appearance and the place where your ancestors originated. That's like it. That's all that we base race on. When it comes to fantasy worlds, however, there's a huge difference because in a fantasy world, when you speak of race, you are talking about separate beings with completely different DNA and oftentimes completely different origins altogether. You're not talking about just, a difference in hair and eye and skin color or a difference maybe in what part of the world that your family has lived in for generations. You're talking about actual different beings. You could use the phrase species to better specify, but I kind of don't like that term. I feel like that's more of a science fiction term. It tends to be more like, I don't know, it makes us feel kind of like animals. And I feel like in fantasy, when we talk about fantasy races, it always makes me think of like Tolkien and Lewis and, delving into rich mythology and delving into rich history. It feels more magical, more fantastical. For purposes of this video, as well as the workbook to follow, I will be using the terms race and ethnicity separately to mean 2 very different things. You will need both when you are creating the population for your fantasy world. You do not want to make them interchangeable in this case though, because they are very separate things when it comes to fantasy. Okay, let's move forward. The first step in populating your world with fantasy races is to choose your category. There are 5 basic categories when it comes to sentient beings, and they are the following. Number 1, humanoids. These are creatures that, for the most part, look like humans. There are a variety of physical differences, and this can relate either to simple appearance or magical properties. They can include animal features such as wings, scales and gills. They can have an extra set of arms. They can have pointy ears and a tail, but for the most part, they are pretty humanoid looking. These are your creatures like elves, gnomes, dwarves, fairies, banshee, witches, things like that. They look for the most part pretty human. The second category is half human. These are your hybrid beings. These are creatures that maybe they are part human, part animal in equal terms, or maybe they bounce back and forth between being all human and being all animal or creature, or maybe they are predominantly creature with some humanoid features. Good examples of this are centaurs, werewolves, mermaids, you got your harpies, you got your vampires, basically anything that can go interchangeably with an animal or creature or is predominantly creature. Number 3 is sentient creatures and elements. Narnia lovers, you're gonna love this because this is where you get to bring in talking animals. These are beings that would otherwise be considered non-intelligent, but in this instance, because of magic or whatever, they are intelligent beings capable of emotions and empathy and having a soul of some kind. But don't just stop with animals. You can have talking plant life, you can have talking nature elements. Just go crazy with it. Any creature, plant, or natural element can be a sentient being. This doesn't mean that necessarily they can talk to other races, but they can at least talk with each other. You can also take individual elements of nature or of creatures and combine them to make brand new sentient creatures. These would be things like Enfields, Pegasus. You take a little bit of wings and a little bit of fox, you throw it together, a little bit of wings and a little bit of horse, and you throw it together. You end up with a brand new creature, but it's still a creature, not necessarily like what you would think of in terms of a humanoid or a half-human. The 4th category is spirit beings. These are immaterial beings who are commonly in possession of great power, but can come and go as they please or as the wind takes them because they're not tied down to earth by nature. They're usually made out of shadows or beams of light, or they can also be something like a ghost, which would be the actual spirit of a person, or even they could be a spirit of an animal or of an animal group, or a spirit of a plant or a group of nature. Angels and demons also fall into this category because technically they count as spirit beings. So while you can definitely put them more in like the hybrid category where they're pretty humanoid and they do have flesh and bones, but they're also like a spirit being, that's kind of more your call, but usually angels and demons will fall into the spirit being category. The fifth category is deities. These will be your gods and your demigods. Gods and demigods are a central force in mythology, and while they are not present in all fantasy novels, it is a growing trend to include them in fantasy novels because, honestly, if you're gonna have a world, might as well have someone to create it, right? So your basic subcategories obviously are going to be your gods and your demigods, but you can also divide them into your supreme rulers, your under rulers, so they're the same makeup, but they just have different levels of power. You can have gods who are promoted from a human status or a humanoid status, and given these powers, you can also make these deities be in charge of a specific element or a specific event or something of that nature. Think the god of war, the goddess of love, the god of the river. You can also include in these, of course, demigods, which is where a mortal being of some kind mates with an immortal being of some kind, and you end up with a hybrid. Now, technically, I guess this could fall into the hybrid category, but because at this point we are dealing with actual deities, it's necessary to put them in this category instead. Because they're not just hybrids anymore, there's a whole other level of magic happening above them that is very crucial to separate from the rest. Now, you don't have to pick one of these categories. You can mix and match using multiples. You can use all of these categories, populate the world the way that you see it fit, and feel free to mix and match as much as you want with the creatures within these categories. Once you've decided which categories you're going to be using, there is a second step that is kind of important to consider before moving forward, simply because we're talking about fantasy novels. And this is moral, immoral, or mixed. Something that is common in fantasy novels, particularly those that are fashioned after Tolkien's Middle-earth, is to have a race of beings that are either inherently good or inherently evil. The ones that exist solely to be evil are usually ugly, they're gnarly, they're nasty, they kill without thought, they have absolutely no moral base other than to know to kill, kill, kill. And they have no problems whatsoever, even feeding off of each other if there's not enough action or there's not enough food. Equally common in fantasy, of course, is the race that is all good. Usually these are elves or some kind of elf-like creatures, and they are wise and all-knowing and perfect to the point of annoyance. Personal opinion there, sorry, just personal opinion. But basically, they align themselves entirely as a race to being good. In fact, a lot of novels nowadays will have entire races, as in like whole groups of races, that will either fall into the category of good or they'll fall into the category of evil. And there's not a whole lot of mixing within the races of what their morals are going to be. Some readers view both of these options as completely cliched. Some would even go as far as to say that it is wrong to create a race that exists solely for the purpose of evil and has no other purpose in the story other than to be easy to kill without guilt and to serve as the army of the evil big bad. Whatever your take is on this particular situation, you do need to ask some questions about this particular race or these particular races if you are planning on having a good race, a bad race, or anything of that nature. If you're planning on having everything be kind of mixed and up to the individual race or the individual beings within the races, then feel free to skip over this step and just move on to the next one. So some of the questions that you want to ask yourself if you're going to have a race that's entirely evil or entirely good are, why is this race inherently good or inherently evil? How does this manifest itself? Are there ever any exceptions, either by birth or by choice? Are they redeemable or are they defileable? Were they created this way? Did they choose to become this way? Was it just a natural process? Was it the result of some kind of a disaster or enlightenment that happened? Is it a genetic trend for races to either devolve or ascend? Are they the only race to whom this has happened, or has this happened to other races before? Is this a common thing? Is this completely out of the blue? Another thing to consider is how other societies will interact with these races, whether the good ones or the evil ones, and how they interact with the other races as well. Step 3 for fantasy races is to consider original, genre, or unique. When it comes to building fantasy races, there are 3 basic avenues that you will want to take once you've decided what kinds of races you will be using. The first avenue is to research and utilize the original mythologies, legends, and folklore from the ancient cultures you got these creatures from. There's a lot of rich history to discover behind every creature, and you can totally utilize this and create a lot of your history and a lot of the specifics about your races around these old myths and the original version of what these creatures were supposed to be. The second is that you can research and utilize current or classic trends when it comes to fantasy races. Things like Tolkien elves or orcs. Basically, there are a lot of trends, both current and classic, that you can utilize that are already understood, that most people get, and that are no surprise, and so don't require quite as much explanation. And you can totally utilize this in creating them. The third option is to take a fantasy race that already exists, or to take multiple ones and put your own unique spin on their origins and their physical makeup, their magical properties, all that fun stuff. And this leads us right into number 4, which is getting to be a trend in this series of videos. Research! Yes, you have to do research in pretty much every step of this entire process, but don't be afraid, this research is super fun. Many fantasy authors walk into the writing process knowing the basic idea of how many races and what kinds they're going to have in their fantasy world. Other authors come into this experience with absolutely no clue what kind of races they want. All they know is that they want something different and something new and something that hasn't been done a million times before. Whatever your reasons for needing to do the research, this part really is not that difficult. You can do it the old-fashioned way, go to the library, look up mythological creatures, look up histories of ancient cultures, and kind of dig your way through. Or you can just, punch the phrase fantastical beings, fantasy races, uncommon mythological races into Google and come up with lists. And then you can click on the links in those lists and go to all kinds of fun places. I've done this a lot with world building, and it is so much fun. And you come up with so many crazy, fun, and original, unique beings. And if you are planning on building more than one world for more than one series, and I know a lot of us are, those of us who are addicted to series, then you may want to consider investing in some really good books on mythological creatures, fantasy races, things of that nature. And honestly, at this point, I feel like I should mention Pinterest is going to be your best friend. Like, I know there's a big stigma about, oh, Pinterest, it's for crafters and stuff. We can't touch that. No. It is a writer's best friend. It is images galore. Anything that you could want in relation to fantasy races and creatures is gonna be theirs. Be willing to make Pinterest your best friend. At this point, you can fill up a board in 5 minutes with a whole bunch of ideas, and then sift through those ideas and Google those ideas, and it'll help you to narrow your search down without having to sift through endless lists. There are a couple of things you're going to want to consider no matter what fantasy race you are developing. And I'm going to read the list so that I don't forget. So listen. Physical appearance, level of intelligence, ability or means of communicating, things like do they speak, do they use telepathy, do they use sign language, anything like that. Magical properties or lack thereof, life expectancy, reproduction, how it works, average reproduction rates, any limitations or unique methods of having the children, that is, of course. Preferred natural environment, and their origin. Now, we will deal more with their origin when we get into history in next week's video, but you will want to figure out to some degree what their origin story is. And honestly, consider this just one less thing that you'll have to worry about when you go to write your world history later. It's kind of like a bonus checked off your list. And step number 5, ethnic diversity. Remember at the beginning I talked about there's a big difference between race and ethnicity when it comes to fantasy world building. This is where we're going to delve into that and explore the amazing opportunities that ethnicity provides when it comes to making your world not only logical and realistic, but also very colorful, exciting, varied, and fun. Okay, so you've got your basic races lined up, you know what they look like, you know what language they speak, you know all that fun stuff. Now it is time to take those races and divide them up into people groups. Now I know that it is very common in fantasy to just kind of assume that all of your races will stay segregated and stay with their own people in their own nation, and that in theory could solve all of your problems, but it would not make for a very original world, and honestly it would not make for a very realistic one. Realistically, as people groups grow, they expand their territories and then start to break off to create new territories and then begin intermingling with other people groups, especially when you have things like colonization or journeys of discovery where people go off into the unknown to set up their own civilizations for the very first time. Again, these are some things that you will figure out later on when we are going through history, but it is very important to go ahead and think about them now and make as many notes as possible to save time when you come to that part of the process. As you go about creating subcategories within each race, consider that there are many different reasons why people might be considered an ethnic group, not just their skin color or where they come from. It could be the physical features, it could be the place of their ancestors' origin, or it could be even something as simple as their language or level of education. For the Greeks, they considered anyone but themselves an ethnicity that was inferior to them because their language was so pure and elegant, and everyone else sounded like they were saying the words barbar over and over again. In fact, the Greeks used the phrase barbar to mock them and to mimic the noises that they made when they spoke, hence where we got the word barbarian. Fun little free fact there. During this time, it is helpful to pull out those maps that you worked on in step 1. The terrain and the environment where people groups start to grow is going to affect their physical appearance. It's going to affect their means of life. It's going to affect a lot of things that make them an ethnic group and what defines them as a separate people group from the rest of the race. Take those maps and draw where on the map the different people groups of your fantasy races have gone, where they have mingled, where they have stayed segregated. Mix and match it, make it different. You know, if necessary, throw the cards up in the air and let them fall on the map and write down where they landed. I mean, this should probably be a last resort, but hey, I mean, if it's your first resort, then at least you'll have a lot of fun. Remember that different environments develop different physical qualities, and they will also inhibit or enhance levels of advancement, which are usually key when dividing up your world into things like first world, second world, third world, which usually affect ethnicity. Important note here, just because you have decided to only use one race, particularly if it's humans, don't think this is an excuse to not create ethnic diversity within that race. You should still have people of a variety of looks, appearances, languages, dialects, and everything else in your world. Don't do it for political reasons. Don't do it because you're trying to stay trendy. Do it because you care about your world. You want to make it as realistic as possible and as wide and varied and exciting as possible. We'll talk more about people groups and culture as we get on to steps 4 and 5 of this video and the workbook that follows it. But for right now, we'll just say that you do need to come up with some idea of the ethnic diversity within your individual races so that you have something to go with when you get to that. Again, it's one more thing you can knock off your checklist, right? And now we get to the part that so many of us have been waiting for, fantasy creatures. Oh, I love a variety of amazing, scary, beautiful, awesome fantasy creatures. I just love it. And I think a lot of readers do too. And a lot of writers can really just get carried away with this, have so much fun. And I hope that you will too as we delve into this section of the video. Now, developing your creatures is going to be a very similar process to developing your fantasy races, although probably not as extensive unless you really have a creature that's of super duper importance to the storyline. Otherwise, they're kind of there more for aesthetics or to be a conflict to be overcome or to be a beast of burden, you name it. Unless it's like crucial to the plot that the audience understands the history behind every single creature in your book, then really this part is mostly for you as the author. So you have the same kind of thing going on. Your step 1 is going to be to figure out your categories. You have some basic categories here. You have animals that are similar to our world animals, but different in a very important aspect. Think like a horse that has wings. That's a similar animal, but with a very distinct difference. Or you have creatures that are common to our world's myths and legends, usually ones that are commonly known. Things like dragons. And then, of course, unique and strange, whether you invent these yourselves or you dig them up out of a mythology that hardly anyone has heard about. These ones are going to be way wild to people. They're not going to know a lot about them. You're probably going to want to make sure that you include some explanation of their appearance that is pretty detailed so that people understand what's going on here. Again, Pinterest is going to be your best friend here because it's easy on Pinterest to find a visual, whether it be artwork or manipulated photography, and get a quick glimpse and understand exactly what this creature looks like, and now it's ingrained in your mind, and as you're writing, it's already right there. You can also use the categories original, genre, or new when it comes to trends or ancient mythological cultures or creating a brand new creature all to yourself. And of course, you want to include your research for this one just like we did with the races, and consider species variety as we did ethnic diversity. When it comes to fantasy creatures, I like to divide all of the ones that I have lined up into 5 categories that are different from the ones we've already talked about. So you have the kinds of creatures you're dealing with. Now I like to do what I call their threat level. This is what helps me to understand how they fit into this world, whether it be in society or out in the wild. So the 5 basic categories are domesticated. These can be beasts of burdens, pets, they could accompany warriors into battle, those kinds of things. You have wild and domesticated, where it's like horses, where you have wild horses and you have domesticated horses, or where you have wild birds and domesticated birds. You can have them be an entirely wild species, but that they pose no threat to humans. You can have them be wild with a minimal threat, as in they will only attack when super aggravated or when defending their young. And of course, you can have them be wild and an active threat. They're the ones that will, if they see you, try to kill you, so you should be very, very careful to just not ever come upon them if possible. Similar to with your fantasy races, you will have a list of elements you want to consider as you're developing these creatures. And again, I'm going to be reading it so that I don't get lost. Things you want to consider with creatures are their natural habitat, their migration patterns, if applicable. Are they common or rare? Are they protected or hunted? Are they useful to people or are they useless? Like, can they be hunted for their pelts, or are they pretty much like they just are like skunks and who would want them after all? Are they beautiful or hideous or anywhere in between? Are there any that are important to religion? Are they considered sacred? Are there any that are considered particularly evil? How does that differ from society to society? From society to society. And of course, you're going to want to explore their origin, just like we explored the origin of our fantasy races. But we're going to get into that even more next week as we discover part 4 of fantasy world building, which is history. All right, guys, that's everything that I have for you this week. I hope you enjoyed it and that you have been getting a lot out of these videos. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing on the way out. I post new videos every Saturday, as well as vlogs occasionally on Wednesdays. And if you're looking for fantasy inspiration, you can always find it right here. All of my social media links, my website, and all the information you could need to know about me, my books, and the services that I offer, as well as the free workbook that is coming with this series. Those will all be in the description box below, as well as, again, the rest of this series of videos in the playlist. I hope you all have an amazing rest of the weekend writing, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.